On the morning of December 7, 1941, the naval base at Pearl Harbor looked like a fortress at rest. The Pacific Fleet lay quiet, its battleships lined up neatly along Battleship Row. The sun rose over the calm waters of Oahu, and for sailors, it was a typical Sunday. Some men were still asleep in their bunks. Others were heading to breakfast or preparing for church. The atmosphere was relaxed, far from the tension of the war already raging across Europe and Asia. To most of those stationed at Pearl Harbor, the idea of an attack on this island base seemed unthinkable. The base had been built up over the years as America's primary stronghold in the Pacific. It housed not just battleships, but also cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and a network of airfields. On paper, it looked secure. The Hawaiian Islands sat far from the Japanese mainland, and many American officers believed distance itself was protection enough. The thought was simple. No enemy fleet could cross thousands of miles of open ocean without being spotted. Even if Japan considered striking, it seemed impossible to launch an attack of any real scale against Pearl Harbor. This sense of security bred a dangerous complacency. Warnings existed, but they were brushed aside. Tensions with Japan had been rising for years. The Japanese had already invaded China and pushed further into Southeast Asia, seeking control of resources like oil, rubber, and tin. The United States had responded with embargoes, cutting off Japan's access to critical supplies. Both nations knew war was likely. Still, American military planners assumed Japan's first move would be in the Philippines, or perhaps in British or Dutch colonies, not Hawaii. Consider the daily scene. On board the USS Arizona, sailors enjoyed breakfast in the mess hall, joking about the night before. On the USS Oklahoma, a group of men were still asleep, unaware of what was coming. On the decks of the USS Nevada, officers inspected the ship's condition, expecting nothing more than routine drills later in the day. The ships were moored close together, an arrangement meant for convenience and repair rather than defense. Packed side by side, they were easy targets, a detail overlooked because no one expected they would ever have to defend themselves at Pearl Harbor. Intelligence reports had hinted at danger. American codebreakers had been monitoring Japanese communications and suspected an attack was possible. But the messages were vague, and Washington officials believed any strike would focus on American or European colonies in Asia. They were told it was a flight of American bombers expected from California. That assumption, made in minutes, helped open the door for disaster. The calm before the storm was deceptive. Out at sea, more than 350 Japanese planes were already on their way. Launched from 6 aircraft carriers positioned north of Hawaii, pilots had trained for months in secrecy, rehearsing the exact routes they would take into Pearl Harbor, the torpedo drops they would make, and the bombs they would unleash. Their mission was clear: cripple the Pacific Fleet in one devastating strike, buying Japan time to expand across the Pacific without interference. Back at Pearl, the base remained unprepared. Anti-aircraft guns were unmanned. Ammunition was locked away. Pilots on the ground had parked aircraft wingtip to wingtip, thinking it would make them easier to guard against sabotage. In reality, it made them perfect targets for strafing runs. Sailors were unaware that within the hour, explosions would rip through the harbor. Flames would engulf steel hulls, and thousands of lives would be lost. Think about the confidence that existed. For years, American officers had believed battleships were the backbone of naval power. Pearl Harbor displayed that strength with pride. The USS California, USS Maryland, USS West Virginia, and others stood as symbols of America's reach across the Pacific. The men who served on them trusted those ships to be their shield. But a shield does little good if the blow comes when you least expect it. The sense of safety in Hawaii was not just about geography, it was about mindset. The United States, though aware of global conflict, had not yet entered the war. Many Americans believed the ocean itself was a barrier, a vast moat that separated them from the chaos in Europe and Asia. That belief echoed all the way to Pearl Harbor, where officers assumed they would have warning if Japan dared to attack. Yet Japan was about to prove that modern warfare ignored distance. Carrier-based planes could fly hundreds of miles, strike, and vanish before defenders even knew what had happened. The Sunday morning routine captured the vulnerability. In nearby neighborhoods, families were preparing for church or planning a day on the beaches. On the base, the band aboard the USS Arizona tuned their instruments for the morning flag-raising ceremony. The mood was calm, almost festive. Sailors joked, families strolled, and officers reviewed schedules. Nobody looked to the sky in fear. Nobody expected the thunder that was already on its way. The stage for disaster was set by a chain of decisions and assumptions. Leaders believed Pearl Harbor was too far away to be threatened. They believed the fleet's strength was enough to deter Japan. They believed their codes and warnings gave them time. Each belief created a false sense of security. When pieced together, they created the perfect conditions for a surprise attack. To see how shocking this was, picture yourself as a sailor on that morning. You rise from your bunk, the smell of coffee filling the mess. Maybe you write a quick letter home, confident it will reach your family in a few weeks. You hear the bugle call signaling the start of the day. Everything feels routine, safe, and predictable. Within an hour, you will hear the scream of engines overhead, the whistle of bombs falling, and the shudder of steel torn apart. But for now, all you know is the calm. That calm was exactly what Japan counted on. Their planners knew that striking first, without warning, would give them the advantage. They needed the element of surprise to neutralize a fleet larger and stronger than their own. Every minute the Americans remained unaware meant one step closer to success for the Japanese attack force. Pearl Harbor looked peaceful that morning, but in reality, it was a trap waiting to be sprung. Ships sat vulnerable in tight formation. Planes sat vulnerable on crowded airfields. Men went about their lives unaware that history was about to turn. It was paradise on the surface, but in less than an hour, paradise would become hell. The calm before the storm at Pearl Harbor was not just about the quiet of the morning. It was about the blindness of an entire military command. They had convinced themselves that they were safe, that their enemies would not dare to strike them at home. That belief was shattered on December 7th, when fire and steel rained down on Oahu. The morning calm was the last breath of peace before the Pacific exploded into war. In the years leading up to Pearl Harbor, the United States had one of the most advanced intelligence operations in the world. American codebreakers were skilled, disciplined, and relentless in their work. They intercepted Japanese diplomatic traffic and broke into the so-called Purple Code, which allowed them to read messages sent between Tokyo and Japanese embassies abroad. By late 1941, these codebreakers had pieced together a picture of Japan's intentions. It was clear Japan planned to strike somewhere in the Pacific. The problem was not a lack of intelligence, but a failure to share it in a way that could save lives. The military and political leaders in Washington had pieces of the puzzle. They knew Japan was preparing for a bold move, and they suspected it would happen soon. Yet the information was fragmented, scattered across different departments and agencies. Messages were decoded by one office but held too long before reaching another. Some reports were so vague that commanders did not know how to act on them. Others were specific, but never made it into the hands of those who needed them most. The officers at Pearl Harbor, think about what this meant in practice. Washington intercepted a message ordering Japanese diplomats in the United States to destroy their codes. That is a clear signal of war, because nations do not destroy their secret codes unless they expect to lose them in a conflict. Washington saw this, but Pearl Harbor's commanders did not. Another message instructed the Japanese embassy to divide information about the American fleet into categories. Focusing on ships anchored at Pearl, that was a red flag. Why would Japan need such detailed reports unless they were planning to attack the base? Again, the warning did not reach Admiral Husband Kimmel or General Walter Short, the two men in charge at Pearl Harbor. Imagine you are Admiral Kimmel, responsible for the safety of the Pacific Fleet. You are on an island thousands of miles from Washington, relying on messages sent by cable and radio. You know tensions with Japan are rising, but no one tells you about the intercepted codes, the destroyed ciphers, or the embassy's strange reports. To you, Pearl Harbor still looks like a secure fortress. You might prepare for sabotage by locking planes close together, but you are not bracing for waves of bombers and torpedo planes to descend out of the sky. Without the intelligence you need, your view of the threat is incomplete. One of the most striking examples of this failure came just hours before the attack. On the night of December 6th, American codebreakers intercepted a long Japanese message. It was the final part of a 14-part communication from Tokyo to its embassy in Washington, essentially breaking off diplomatic negotiations. President Franklin D. Roosevelt read it and reportedly muttered, "This means war." But the warning was not relayed with urgency to Pearl Harbor. By the time the base received word, Japanese planes were already on their way. This breakdown was not caused by a single mistake, but by a web of issues. Rivalries between the Army and Navy meant intelligence was often kept within one branch rather than shared broadly. Bureaucratic delays slowed the flow of critical information. Some officers in Washington underestimated the risk of an attack on Pearl Harbor, so they did not prioritize sending warnings there. Even when warnings did arrive, they were often too vague. For example, Pearl Harbor received general alerts saying hostile action possible. But without details on where or when, a commander can't overhaul defenses based on vague language. He needs specifics to act. The lack of coordination also meant that radar operators on Oahu were left without guidance. On the morning of December 7th, one radar station picked up a massive incoming formation of aircraft. The young operators reported it to a duty officer, but he dismissed it as a group of American B-17 bombers expected from California. He had no reason to believe otherwise, because he had not been told to expect an attack. Had intelligence been shared properly, those radar operators might have been trained to recognize the difference between friendly and hostile approaches. Consider a modern scenario to make this clearer. Imagine a fire department knows there is a wildfire spreading quickly in the hills near a city. But instead of telling the local fire stations exactly where it is, the message gets stuck in paperwork and phone calls. The local crews keep watering lawns, unaware that flames are already racing toward them. By the time they realize the danger, the fire has already consumed half the town. That is what happened at Pearl Harbor. The fire was coming, but the men on the ground had no idea how close it was. The irony is that America had the intelligence it needed to be prepared. The codebreakers had done their job. The analysts had spotted the clues. The problem was that the system for sharing that intelligence was broken. Washington sat on warnings, delayed reports, and underestimated the urgency. Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, sailors prepared for a quiet Sunday, their commanders blind to the storm about to hit them. The lack of coordinated intelligence did more than cost lives on December 7th. It exposed a weakness in how the United States handled information during wartime. After Pearl Harbor, the government created new systems to ensure intelligence flowed faster and more directly. But on that morning in 1941, the failure to connect the dots meant that more than 2,400 Americans would die in an attack that could have been at least partially anticipated. This part of the story is what makes Pearl Harbor so haunting. It wasn't just the Japanese skill in planning the attack. It was the fact that the Americans had seen pieces of the plan, but could not put them together in time. Messages sat unread. Reports went unshared. Warnings were vague. The men at Pearl Harbor were left unaware, unready, and unarmed against what was about to come. And so, as Japanese aircraft carriers steamed toward Oahu, their pilots ready for takeoff, the Pacific Fleet slept. The warning signs had been there all along, buried in decoded messages and scattered across desks in Washington. But because the system failed to coordinate, those warnings never reached the people who needed them most. If you've been following along, you know this is only the beginning of the story. To hear the next part, and to keep exploring how this failure unfolded step by step, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian so you don't miss the rest of this series. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the scene at Pearl Harbor might have looked calm to anyone walking the docks or glancing across the rows of aircraft parked neatly on the airfields. To the average sailor or soldier stationed there, the biggest worry was boredom or routine guard duty. But beneath that quiet surface lay a chain of leadership failures that would soon prove catastrophic. The men in command, the ones responsible for protecting the fleet and air bases, had prepared for the wrong kind of attack. They expected sabotage, not airstrikes. That single assumption shaped almost every defensive decision leading up to the attack. And it left one of the most important naval bases in the world exposed at its most vulnerable point. To understand how this failure unfolded, you have to picture how commanders thought at the time. Hawaii was far from Japan, thousands of miles of open ocean between the two. Naval officers believed that any attack across such distance would be detected long before it reached them. The Pacific Fleet was considered too large, too strong, and too far away from enemy airfields to be hit by surprise. Instead, leaders thought the real danger was Japanese agents sneaking onto the islands and blowing up planes or planting bombs. They imagined acts of sabotage, not waves of bombers. So their orders and preparations all leaned toward preventing that kind of threat. At the air bases, this thinking took a dangerous form. Commanders ordered planes to be parked wingtip to wingtip, lined up close together in neat rows. The idea was simple. If you kept all the planes bunched up, you could guard them more easily against someone slipping in at night to plant explosives. But in practice, this arrangement created a perfect target. Japanese pilots later described their disbelief when they saw the airfields below. Dozens of American planes parked so tightly that one bomb could set off a chain of destruction. Instead of having to hunt down scattered aircraft, they only had to fire into one cluster, and entire squadrons were disabled within minutes. The same mistake appeared in how the Navy handled its battleships. On Battleship Row, the pride of the Pacific Fleet sat moored side by side. The ships were not dispersed around the harbor or kept at sea on patrol. This made them much easier to protect from imagined sabotage, but it also made them sitting ducks once the first torpedo bombers appeared. Imagine a row of parked cars with their engines off, doors locked, and keys inside. If a thief comes one by one, maybe they're safe. But if someone brings a bulldozer, that whole row is gone in a single push. That's what the battleships looked like to the Japanese pilots flying in low that morning. Another glaring failure was the lack of air patrols. The Pacific Fleet had long-range reconnaissance planes capable of sweeping the ocean for hundreds of miles. Yet commanders rarely ordered these patrols on a consistent basis. Why? Because they assumed Japan would never dare strike directly at Pearl Harbor. Patrols were costly, and crews were tired of constant training flights. Leadership convinced themselves the risk wasn't worth the effort. But on that December morning, it meant no one spotted the Japanese carriers, no one saw the incoming squadrons, and the entire harbor slept until it was too late. The warning signs were there, but leadership either dismissed them or didn't act fast enough. Early radar stations picked up incoming planes before the attack began. Two young operators saw the blip on their screen, a massive formation approaching the island. They reported it up the chain. But their superior dismissed it as American B-17 bombers scheduled to arrive from California. That mistake tied directly back to the mindset of higher command. They could not imagine Japan launching a large-scale airstrike, so they assumed the evidence must mean something else. By the time the truth was realized, the first bombs were already falling on the airfields. The blame for these failures did not fall on any single officer. Both Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, and General Walter Short, who oversaw the Army's defense of Hawaii, shared responsibility. Each man prepared for sabotage rather than air assault. Each believed the fleet was safe because Japan lacked the ability to project power so far across the ocean. Their judgment shaped the orders given to subordinates, and those orders created a situation where the strongest fleet in the Pacific was left vulnerable in its own home port. It's worth asking why such experienced officers would make these choices. The answer lies partly in history. For decades, naval theory taught that large battleships were the ultimate weapon of sea power. Airplanes were seen as supporting tools, not the main strike force. That mindset blinded many officers to what Japan had been developing. Japanese forces had spent years training in carrier warfare, perfecting techniques for long-distance strikes. Meanwhile, American commanders still thought in terms of sabotage and ship-to-ship battles. They failed to imagine the future of war until it was literally flying overhead. Think about what might have been different if leadership had acted otherwise. If planes were dispersed across airfields instead of parked wing to wing, some would have survived the first wave and could have fought back. If ships had been spread out or sent to sea on patrol, torpedoes and bombs might not have crippled so many in one strike. If air patrols had been flown that morning, the Japanese fleet could have been spotted hours in advance, giving time to man anti-aircraft guns and scramble fighters. Each decision mattered, but every choice leaned toward the wrong assumption, and the result was disaster. The Japanese attack exposed more than gaps in defense. It revealed how rigid thinking, flawed assumptions, and cautious leadership can be as dangerous as the enemy itself. At Pearl Harbor, the failure wasn't just about guns left unmanned or planes parked in rows. It was about leaders who could not see past what they thought the enemy would do. That blindness turned a quiet Sunday morning into one of the most devastating moments in American military history. The attack on Pearl Harbor is often remembered for the flames, the explosions, and the chaos that tore through the harbor that morning. On a tactical level, it was one of the most well-executed surprise attacks in military history. Japan's planners had studied Pearl Harbor for months, rehearsed their maneuvers, and committed themselves to pulling off a strike so devastating that it would cripple American power in the Pacific. And for a few short hours, it looked like they had succeeded. 19 American ships were either sunk or badly damaged. 8 of them were battleships, the pride of the U.S. Navy at the time, the USS Arizona. Struck by a bomb that detonated its forward magazine, erupted in an explosion so violent it killed over 1,000 men instantly. The USS Oklahoma rolled over after being hit by torpedoes, trapping hundreds of sailors below deck. Other ships were left burning, half submerged, or spewing smoke into the sky. In less than 2 hours, the Japanese had inflicted more damage on the Pacific Fleet than anyone thought possible. The human cost was just as staggering. Over 2,400 Americans lost their lives that day. With another 1,000 wounded, sailors drowned in compartments as ships capsized. Airmen were killed before they could even climb into their cockpits. Families on the island watched in shock as bombs fell, smoke blackened the sky, and oil fires burned across the water. For those on the ground, the attack felt like a complete disaster, a strike that had knocked the United States to its knees. From the Japanese perspective, the attack went almost exactly as planned. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the operation, had gambled everything on achieving surprise. His fleet of 6 carriers had sailed across the North Pacific, remaining undetected, to launch over 350 planes against the base. The attack came in 2 waves, coordinated with precision. Dive bombers screamed down on battleships, torpedo planes skimmed the water to deliver their deadly payloads. Fighters strafed airfields, cutting down rows of American planes before they ever had the chance to take off. It was a textbook display of carrier warfare. Japan had pioneered the use of aircraft carriers as offensive weapons, and Pearl Harbor showed the world just how effective they could be. In a matter of hours, the Japanese proved that battleships, once considered the ultimate measure of naval power, could be destroyed from the sky. On the surface, Pearl Harbor was a flawless tactical victory. But victories in war are not measured only in tactics. They are measured in strategy, in whether short-term gains create long-term success. And this is where Pearl Harbor turned into a blunder that would haunt Japan. Despite all the damage they inflicted, the Japanese failed to hit the most important targets. The oil depots that stored fuel for the Pacific Fleet were untouched. The massive above-ground tanks at Pearl Harbor held enough fuel to keep the Navy running for months. Destroying them would have forced the U.S. to resupply from the West Coast, a logistical nightmare that could have paralyzed American operations in the Pacific. Yet the Japanese never bombed them. The repair facilities at Pearl Harbor were also left standing. Dry docks, workshops, and machine shops that kept ships seaworthy remained intact. This meant that many of the damaged vessels could be salvaged, repaired, and sent back into service. Within months, several ships that had been written off as destroyed were back at sea, hunting the same Navy that had struck them down. Most importantly, the American aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor that morning. The USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga were all away at sea. Carriers were the true backbone of modern naval warfare, even if many still clung to the belief in battleships. By missing these ships, Japan failed to remove the weapons that would later be used against them at battles like Midway and the Coral Sea. To put it simply, Japan had knocked down the door, but left the foundation standing. They inflicted wounds that looked mortal, but the heart of American naval power still beat strong. In fact, the very scale of the attack may have ensured Japan's defeat. By striking so hard and killing so many, they left the United States with no choice but to fight with everything it had. Admiral Yamamoto himself understood this better than anyone. He had studied in the United States and knew the country's industrial might. Japan could never match America in a war of attrition. His only hope was that a decisive blow would shock the Americans into staying out of the Pacific. Instead, the attack united the nation. The next day, Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote. The United States had been dragged into the conflict, and it brought with it resources and manpower far beyond anything Japan could ever muster. It's worth pausing to consider what might have happened if the Japanese had struck those other targets. Imagine if the oil tanks had been set ablaze, sending firestorms across the harbor. The Pacific Fleet might have run dry within weeks. Or if the dry docks had been destroyed, every damaged ship would have had to limp back to California, delaying recovery by years. And if the carriers had been caught in port, America might have lost its ability to project naval power at all. Japan came close to pulling off the impossible, but in war, close is never enough. The attack also revealed a flaw in Japanese strategy itself. They believed that by crippling the fleet, they could buy time to secure their empire across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. But by failing to neutralize America's ability to rebuild, they guaranteed a war of endurance, a kind of war. Japan was destined to lose. Pearl Harbor gave them an immediate tactical victory, but it planted the seeds of strategic defeat. There is another layer to this miscalculation. In focusing on ships and planes, Japan underestimated the resilience of the American people. The attack was meant to demoralize, to terrify, to convince the United States to withdraw from the Pacific. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Recruitment surged. Factories shifted overnight to wartime production. A country that had been deeply divided about entering the war now stood united in purpose. The very strike meant to keep America out of the fight had guaranteed that it would enter the fight with a vengeance. Pearl Harbor shows how a battle can be both brilliant and foolish at the same time. The Japanese pilots executed their mission with precision and courage. Their commanders had planned every detail. They struck with speed and surprise. And yet, the victory they achieved lasted only a few hours. By leaving key assets untouched and by underestimating the will of their enemy, they ensured that the war they started would not end on their terms. The morning of December 7, 1941, did more than destroy ships and take lives. It shattered an entire worldview. For decades, many Americans believed that oceans protected them from foreign wars. Europe might burn, Asia might collapse into conflict, but the United States could stay apart, safe behind its distance and its strength. Pearl Harbor destroyed that illusion in less than 2 hours. The attack was shocking not only because of its scale, but because of what it represented. The United States had not declared war. There had been tense negotiations with Japan, but the talks were still underway. Many in Washington thought Japan might strike somewhere in Asia, but few expected a direct blow at the heart of the Pacific Fleet. When the bombs fell, they were not just destroying steel and killing sailors. They were announcing to the American people that the country was no longer safe. The sense of betrayal cut deep. Newspaper headlines screamed of treachery. Families gathered around radios, listening in disbelief as President Franklin Roosevelt delivered his speech, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. That phrase was more than rhetoric. It captured the rage of a nation that had been caught off guard and humiliated on its own soil. In the span of a single day, isolationism, the belief that America could remain neutral in world affairs, was dead. Before Pearl Harbor, polls showed that many Americans did not want to be dragged into Europe's war. Britain was fighting for survival, and Nazi Germany had spread across the continent. But there was still hesitation about full involvement. Pearl Harbor erased that hesitation. By attacking without warning, Japan had done what years of diplomacy and speeches could not. It unified the American people in support of total war. Congress declared war on Japan almost instantly, with just one vote against. A few days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, declared war on the United States, forcing America into a global conflict. What began as a Pacific tragedy had become a world-altering event. The United States, once reluctant, was now fully committed. The consequences rippled out quickly. Young men lined up at recruiting stations in every city and town. Factories retooled overnight to build planes, tanks, and weapons. Women stepped into jobs left open by men heading to war, filling assembly lines and proving vital to the war effort. Entire communities transformed. The sense of purpose was immediate and overwhelming. Pearl Harbor became the moral justification for war that leaders needed. Americans were not fighting only because allies asked for help. They were fighting because they themselves had been attacked. Every bomb dropped on Battleship Row became a rallying cry. Posters, films, and speeches all invoked Pearl Harbor as the reason for sacrifice. The slogan "Remember Pearl Harbor" spread across the country, painted on walls, shouted at rallies, and sung in songs. It turned grief and anger into determination. Think about the scale of the change. In 1940, the United States had a modest military, ranked 17th in the world in size. Within a few years of Pearl Harbor, it commanded the largest and most powerful armed forces on Earth. The attack that was meant to cripple America instead forced it to unleash its full industrial and military potential. By 1945, that power would not only help defeat Japan and Germany, but also reshape the global order. Pearl Harbor also changed how Americans saw themselves. The attack created a sense of vulnerability, but it also forged unity. People who had been divided along political or regional lines suddenly saw themselves as part of the same fight. For the first time in generations, the United States felt truly bound together by a single purpose. It was no longer about whether to join the war. It was about how to win it. Japan's leaders did not anticipate this outcome. They thought the United States would be too shocked and wounded to fight back effectively. They believed Americans were soft, unwilling to endure the hardships of war. But they misunderstood the depth of American resolve. Pearl Harbor gave the United States not only a reason to fight, but also a moral high ground. The war was no longer a distant foreign. Struggle was personal. This single event also shifted the balance of World War II. Britain, which had been holding out alone against Hitler's Europe, suddenly had the most powerful new ally imaginable. The Soviet Union, already locked in a brutal fight with Germany, now knew the Americans would bring pressure from another front. The world map was redrawn, not in borders yet, but in alliances and expectations. Pearl Harbor changed the war from a regional conflict to a truly global one. The emotional weight of that morning lasted far beyond the smoke and fire. Survivors carried it for the rest of their lives. Families who lost loved ones remembered the shock and grief. But as a nation, the United States turned that pain into a rallying point. It fueled not just the first months of war, but the entire struggle that followed. If we look back, the most remarkable thing about Pearl Harbor is how a devastating defeat became the spark of overwhelming strength. In the short term, Japan celebrated a victory. In the long term, they had unleashed a power far greater than they imagined. The attack that was supposed to keep America out of the Pacific ensured that it would never leave until the war was won. That is why Pearl Harbor stands as one of the most world-altering events in history. It was more than a military strike. It was a moment that forced a nation to rise, changed the direction of a global conflict, and set the stage for a new world order. And that brings us to the end of this series. If you've made it this far into the story of Pearl Harbor, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more surprising history told plain and clear, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. This was part 5 of 5, and I'll see you in the next story.